Hello biologist, and welcome to your next screencast. Today we'll finish chapter 23 in our discussion of ecosystem ecology. When we left off, we talked about how the Arctic has experienced warming at almost twice the rate as the rest of the world. This is called Arctic amplification. This map shows that in 2012, which was one of the hottest years on record at the time, the Arctic had a warmer year than almost anywhere else in the world. It also shows that some places warmed while other places cooled. Global warming isn't always even and refers to global average temperatures. Arctic amplification has led to the melting of Arctic ice, and this has affected many of the organisms that live there. Polar bears, for example, depend on polar ice for camouflage as they hunt for animals like seals. According to one study, Canadian polar bears weigh about 55 pounds less than they did 30 years ago. This affects their health, their immune systems, and their reproductive ability. These photos show that polar bears are having trouble feeding. These photos show how polar bears These photos hint at how polar bears may have These photos hint at how polar bears may These photos hint at how polar bears may be having trouble feeding themselves. Okay. These photos hint at how polar bears may be having trouble feeding themselves. The struggles of the polar bear are concerning scientists because polar bears are top predators in this ecosystem. As polar bear numbers decrease, this may disrupt. Okay. These photos hint at how polar bears may be having trouble feeding themselves. Scientists around the world are concerned because polar bears are top predators in this ecosystem. Without the polar bears, the balance of nature may be disrupted. The map on the left shows median sea ice extent between 1979 and 2000. The map on the right shows Arctic sea ice on September 16, 2012. It shows that on this date, the area of Arctic sea ice was almost half of the median. According to the vast majority of climate scientists, humans are changing the climate more than anything else. One piece of evidence is that carbon dioxide concentrations are at their highest they've been in 700,000 years. Science has also shown that this carbon dioxide is coming from the burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are carbon-rich energy sources formed from compressed, fossilized remains of organisms over millions of years. Coal, oil, and natural gas are all examples of fossil fuels. To better understand how this works, we need to know something about the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is the movement of carbon atoms between organic and inorganic molecules in the environment. Carbon often moves around the environment in the form of carbon dioxide. The diagram shows that decomposition, animals, and combustion or burning produce carbon dioxide. Plants take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The formation of fossil fuels, which is not shown in this diagram, stores carbon in the ground. This infographic is another representation of the carbon cycle. It also shows that more carbon dioxide is added to the atmosphere than is removed from it. It also shows that carbon dioxide produced from human activity is responsible for this. Climate scientists have been able to measure changes in carbon dioxide over the last 700,000 years due to work done with ice cores from glaciers. Cylindrical ice cores are removed from glaciers. Each ice core contains layers of ice. Each layer of ice has trapped bubbles of gas. This gas can be analyzed to directly measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in previous years. In this infographic, you can see an ice core and the gas bubbles that were trapped inside it. Historical levels of carbon dioxide determined from these gas bubbles and these ice cores is graphed on the lower left. This data was compared to data collected in the present day from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. All of this data shows alarming increases in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. In addition to the carbon cycle, there are other element cycles that are important to life on Earth. A second one is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is important to life because living things require nitrogen compounds such as proteins and nucleic acids. A reservoir is a supply or source of something, and air is the major reservoir of nitrogen. 79% of the atmosphere is nitrogen gas. Most organisms, however, cannot use nitrogen in this form. The only things that can remove nitrogen from the air are lightning and bacteria. This process is called nitrogen fixation. Plants will get their nitrogen in a fixed form from the soil. Nitrogen in the soil can be found as nitrate ions, ammonium ions, and urea. Animals will get their nitrogen from consuming plants or other animals. This diagram is a representation of the nitrogen cycle. As you try to understand the nitrogen cycle better, first focus on the major players, and then the major processes, and finally the details. A third element cycle is the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is important to living things because phosphorus is an essential nutrient that is part of DNA molecules, ATP, and the phospholipids that make up cell membranes. Phosphorus differs from carbon and nitrogen because phosphorus cannot be found in air. Instead, phosphorus moves slowly from deposits on land and in sediments to living things, and then much more slowly back into the soil and into water sediment. Okay. This diagram is a representation of the phosphorus cycle. The important thing to note here is that phosphorus does not have an This diagram is a representation of the phosphorus cycle. The important thing to note here is that the phosphorus cycle does not have an atmospheric component. Going back to the carbon cycle, we can look at our contribution to climate change by looking at our carbon footprint. A carbon footprint is defined as the measure of the total greenhouse gases produced by human activities. There are several things that contribute to a carbon footprint, including burning fossil fuels, agriculture, deforestation, and concrete production. This pie chart provides a breakdown of greenhouse gas emissions in 2011 in the United States. It shows that transportation and electricity are the two biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in our country. In this last section, we'll take a quick look at climate zones. The Earth has three major climate zones. Around the equator, we have the tropical zone. The tropical zone is warm year-round. In the middle latitudes, both above and below the equator, we have temperate zones. Temperate zones have warm summers and cool winters, separated by spring and fall. Around the North Pole and the South Pole, we have polar zones. Polar zones have cool summers and bitterly cold winters. The various climate zones on Earth are created by the tilt of the Earth and the movement of the Earth around the Sun. At different times during the year, the angle at which sunlight hits the Earth, called the angle of insolation, will change, as well as the number of daylight hours. The big misconception that people have is that seasons are caused by the distance between the Earth and the Sun changing. That's simply not true.